So several of you were in the talk yesterday about capital planning, and we didn't really do introductions in that one because over the course of the presentation, we really kind of explained why we were talking about capital planning. I don't think it's as obvious for this one, so if you'll indulge me, I'll give just a little bit of introduction. So I am an architect by training. I still practice as an architect, but I have spent the last 25 years of my architectural practice working in medical imaging, and from the very beginning fell in love with MRI as a modality. And then when the original ACR white paper on MR safety came out in 2002, and I was doing an MRI project at the time, I really became shocked and alarmed at how little architectural design standard protections there were for MRI safety. And so I took up the banner of being the advocate for architectural or design safety protections. And that over time sort of metastasized into a very broad interest in MRI safety. I sit on the HGRC, Healthcare Guidelines Revisions Committee. They're the group that publishes the FGI. FGI is the design standard that most states in the union use as their licensing standard for healthcare facilities. California being a notable exception to that. California, however, copies and pastes large chunks of what FGI publishes, so a lot of it winds up working into California. I am a twice member of the ACR's MRI Safety Committee, once by invitation and once because I wheedled my way back onto the committee. After today's presentation, I don't think I'll be asked back for a third time. I am one of the founding board members and past chair of the ABMRS, the American Board of Magnetic Resonance Safety. So while I am an architect, and an architect is probably the last person you would imagine to speak to you on MRI safety, the last few decades of my professional experience have really kind of built on that to bring me to where I am here today. We were offering this in yesterday's, and the offer stands for this presentation. If you would like an MRI architectural suite peer review for safety related, we'll pick one of the attendees from today's session at random and offer that to them. I have slides. I do not have a train of thought. The slides essentially remind me of the things that I want to talk about. But ultimately, this talk is not for me, it is for you. So if you don't understand something, disagree with something, want some clarification on something, I will do my best to make sure that we have Q&A time at the end, but don't let that dissuade you from speaking up during the presentation. You are not going to disrupt the train of thought because there is no train. And anything that you see on the screen is yours to take and to share as you see fit. So the premise of the talk is that accreditation doesn't promise MRI safety the way we think it does. Well, let's back up a second before we start talking about accreditation's specific role with MRI and MRI safety. Let's review what it is that accreditation does in general. Accreditation is ostensibly some sort of promise of quality and safety. CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, essentially says if you as a hospital, as you as an outpatient imaging center provider want to get paid from CMS for care that you deliver to a CMS beneficiary, Medicare, Medicaid, Tricare, you have to maintain accreditation. So CMS actually sets up a structure to approve accrediting organizations so that the accrediting organizations can approve the healthcare provider so that then CMS will reimburse the healthcare provider. Because there is a monetary benefit associated with this, surprise, surprise, 90% of all the hospitals in the United States are accredited. I couldn't find a figure for IDTF's, outpatient imaging centers. I gotta expect that it's similar in that damn near everybody has accreditation in order to be eligible for these reimbursements. So when it comes to individual accrediting organizations and accreditation and the promise of safety, this is actually, I did a screen capture from one of Joint Commission websites pages. This is just a couple of weeks ago. And I Googled Joint Commission patient safety. And this was the top result that popped up. Patient safety, surpass your safety targets. Okay? What is the implied message in this marketing, right? Surpass your safety targets. Maybe you were good on your own without our help, without our oversight on our structures, but whatever you were capable of doing on your own, you're going to do better if you are Joint Commission accredited, right? Surpass your safety targets. Whatever you set for yourself, you will do better with us. Okay, all right. ACR. If any of your sites have ACR MR accreditation, when you complete your accreditation review and they approve you, you get a package from them that includes the little gold window sticker that you stick on the front door and a blank press release. Facility name here earns ACR accreditation, right? And you're just supposed to copy and paste your facility name in and send it off to the local news organizations. I want to zero in on the second paragraph in this ACR provided press release. The ACR Gold Seal of Accreditation, this is MR accreditation, represents the highest level of image quality and patient safety. Whatever you might have done without ACR, because you have ACR, you now have assurances. You are representing the highest level of image quality and patient safety. So whatever you could have done per the interpretation of Joint Commission, whatever you could have done on your own, we're going to make sure you do it better because you're Joint Commission accredited. ACR says whatever it was that you were able to do before, with us, you will achieve the highest level possible. I don't believe either of those two statements, and I don't think that anybody else should either.
Please go back over it.
Yeah.
The highlight, here it goes.
Right. ACR Gold Seal of Accreditation, and this is for MRI, so represents the highest level of image quality and patient safety. So I took that exact highlighted text, highest level of image quality and patient safety, because I wanted to figure out, is this marketing hyperbole? You know, our product is 11 bazillion times better than our competitors, and everybody recognizes that for being kind of hollow and empty and, you know, just sort of posturing. So I wanted to figure out, does anybody actually use the canned ACR press release when they get accreditation? So I did a Google search. I used that exact phrase plus MRI. I limited the search results to just the last year. I wanted to figure out, has any, you know, do imaging centers, do hospitals like Duke Health, like Olean General Hospital, like Evergreen Health, and it goes on for page after page after page of healthcare providers who achieved MRI, ACR MR accreditation, who copied and pasted that press release verbatim, or at least that section of the press release verbatim, the ACR logos and the search results, over and over and over again. So the ACR represents this to its customers, but its customers, the healthcare providers, apparently think that that's a message that they legitimately should put forward to the public, to their customer base, and they do it over and over and over again. So it's not empty hyperbole, or at least it's not portrayed as sort of empty hyperbole. It's portrayed as, this is legit. This is what you get when you are accredited by our organization. So, the commission promises safety, promises superior safety. ACR promises the highest levels of safety. With respect to MRI, how has that worked out historically over time? So a number of years ago, Dr. Canal and I did this, for me, really eye-opening exercise. The FDA has an adverse event database that any of us with a web browser can search. If you Google MAUDE, M-A-U-D-E, which is a tortured acronym that I can't remember what it means, but if you Google FDA MAUDE search, it'll take you directly to their search interface. And any FDA regulated drug or device adverse event reports that get filed, you can search on the MAUDE database. And you can essentially find every adverse event classified for a specific drug, a specific device. Device type, you can't, search specifically for GE 3T magnets, but you can search all MRIs for adverse events. So we've done that over time, every year. And the adverse event numbers are relatively small, so it's probably not appropriate to just compare raw numbers, but given that nothing in the reporting structures for FDA reporting have changed in the last 20 years, what I do think is valid is to kind of look at percentage change year over year and see where are we trending over time. So in this graph, the bottom axis is time, starting from the year 2000 and using that as our 0 point and looking at percentage change every year from the year 2000. We track both IV procedure volume, how many MRIs are performed in the United States annually, and really, again, we're looking at percentage change using the year 2000 as a baseline. And then we're looking at MAUDE, the FDA's adverse event database, LMH. Every device in the FDA's database, device type in the FDA's database has a 3-letter code. And of course, the 3-letter code for MRI in the FDA database is LNH. Don't ask me why. But if you go on the MAUDE database, and there's product code, if you type in LNH, you will get the results for MRI devices. So what does procedure volume look like, or the change in procedure volume look like over the last 20 years? It's a fairly consistent, fairly uniform growth until 2020 and COVID essentially dropped imaging volumes off a cliff. But year over year, in general, there's been about a 3% average growth in total MRI procedure volume in the United States, year over year. And if we do sort of a best fit curve, and I just eyeballed this, the green arrow line is sort of the general average trajectory of the imaging volume growth curve. So this is year over year percentage change in MRI volume in the United States. This is year over year percentage change in reported MRI accidents to the US FDA. And if anybody's going to geek out on the math, the slope of the accident curve, and again, I'm ignoring this inexplicable camel hump in the middle of the data from like 2008 to 2012. Yeah?
So what is the requirements in the reporting? So when you say these are the reported events, I'm almost sure that a lot of events are going unreported, right?
The vast majority of
The requirement for reporting to the MAUDE database is that there are two, if the incident involved an injury or death to the patient, or could lead to an injury or death.
So you're exactly right. There are 3 reporting criteria. The only unambiguous one is if you kill somebody. If you kill somebody with a device, you have to report it to the FDA. And in fact, both the manufacturer and the healthcare provider both have to send reports to the FDA under that instance. They get side-based.
If the manufacturer reports it and we don't report this facility, it's $250,000.
Okay, so
That's covered under the safety medical device.
both the company, the hospital and
The vendor.
kind of piecing each other.
In the instance of death, the rules change as soon as we're not talking about death. The other two criteria are serious injury and unreasonable risk of either death or serious injury. I asked the FDA 2 separate occasions what constitutes serious injury, and I received 2 very different responses. One of them was, well, we're not healthcare providers. We don't make determinations as to what is serious or not. We would expect the healthcare provider to determine whether it's serious or not. That was answer number 1. Answer number 2 that I received, because my jaw kind of dropped open and I was like, wait a minute, so this is the fox guarding the hen house kind of thing. So I followed up and it went higher up. And the second answer I got back was hospital admission is the litmus test for whether an accident was serious or not. So a broken bone, lacerations, being rendered unconscious, as long as you were, released from the facility within 24 hours of being observed, if it wasn't a full admission, that technically is not required to be reported to the FDA. And once you get into serious injury or unreasonable risk of death or serious injury, now the reporting obligation no longer is shared by the healthcare provider. Now the reporting obligation is 100% on the manufacturer. So does the hospital call GE, Siemens, Philips, whoever, every time there is an adverse event in their facility and say, hey guys, we want to let you know, we almost killed somebody. Would you please kindly tell the FDA? There's no obligation for the healthcare provider to tell the manufacturer. There is a requirement if the manufacturer is made aware that they have to report it to the FDA.
It's always been a gray area about that could. It's always been a very.
Oh yeah, unreasonable risk. If we can't even agree what a serious injury is, how on earth are we going to agree what a unreasonable risk of that is?
That's kind of.
Yeah.
Okay. And I invested in new policy in 1993. A guy, a gentleman by the name of Marsh Shepard, and ours mandated that anything that we felt could lead to an injury, didn't matter how it happened, we required our hospital to report it to the manufacturer and to the FDA. And why? Because at that point in time, we didn't want to take on the liability, and our legal department mandated that. Instead of just having this unambiguous thing, we would just.
Yeah. And
sometimes the over-reporting results in that type of thing.
Yeah.
Where you see a swing, because even though SMDA 1990 wasn't implemented until the mid-90s, people didn't really start complying with it until 2000. And then that spike in 2004 came about because of some reinforcement. So what you saw was an overreaction, and now your data is showing that it's bouncing back up.
Yeah. The thing that I want us to, if you don't walk away with any other piece of information out of this presentation, the trajectory of these 2 curves, so the slope of these 2 lines, indicate to us 2 alarming things. Number 1, as a proportion of MRI scans, we have a greater number of adverse events today than we did 20 years ago. Because we are doing more MRI studies, this means that we are quantitatively injuring more greater number of MRI patients today than we were 20 years ago.
So let me ask, did you happen to measure that against the data of number of devices used in the country at that time too?
No, I couldn't find reliable data on the number of MR scanners, which would be an interesting sort of third.
I would bet that correlation was flat. I suspect that correlation is flat.
But, ultimately what we're concerned about is delivering MRI care to patients. So the number of MR exams performed, whether that was on one magnet or 5 zillion magnets, the safety of examinations performed. So yes, I think the number of total magnets would be an interesting.
Well, if you're using more magnets, you have more technicians using them, so you have more opportunity for safety issues. That's the only concern I have. I would be curious about the correlation.
I would like
Because I
to.
know that the number of magnets in this country has increased because of the technology, and now with things being more they drop in views, fMRI, all this types of studies, you're gonna see more and more. But I wouldn't help it, there's more incidents.
Yeah.
We've seen it across the board, not just within our, we've seen it with all medical devices.
Tobias, what about, is there seem to be more reporting in the hospital space versus the outpatient? Because I know, especially connecting with a lot of people, they are more apt in the outpatient facilities to try to make it work, right? So the manufacturer recommends not centering, the device, okay, we'll put it at the edge of the field of use. I think there's a lot of off-label things being done in the outpatient space,
Right.
but I wonder how much they are reporting any type of event.
So you hit on two really interesting elements with that one question. The FDA, the data that is publicly available through the MOD interface, essentially scrubs most of the detail about who the provider is. So we can't make direct comparisons in terms of accident rates between hospitals and outpatient imaging centers from
You
the
can't.
cannot.
Okay.
The FDA data does not. If you read the narrative, sometimes you can figure out, oh, this is an inpatient facility, but not always. The narratives are highly variable. The second thing is, so you have, off-label scanning of implants and devices, and that's this information. The red line data that I was showing you from MOD is adverse events that are classified under the LNH product code, the MRI product code. If there is a negative interaction between an MRI and an implanted medication pump, or a neurostimulator, or a pacemaker, or a vagal nerve stimulator, the adverse event gets reported under the code of the device that malfunctioned. So negative interactions between an MR and an FDA-regulated implant or device are not reported under the MRI product code. So everything involving interactions with implants and devices is data that leaks out of that chart that I just showed you. So wherever the red line is with the adverse events that are classified under the MRI product code, on top of that are the adverse events that are the product of MRI's interaction with implants and devices that get reported under the implant or device product code. And there are many. As we might expect, particularly with changes in clinical use in MRI, 20 years ago, every MRI manufacturer in their operator's manual had big bold print disclaimers. Under no circumstances are you to image a patient who has any kind of foreign body or implant or device. You're going to kill them. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing here, but there were really strong contraindications in the MR operator's manual, system operator's manuals, that said, no way, Jose, do you scan anybody, anything other than the patient's own tissues. If there's something else there, you shouldn't be MR scanning this patient. Today, probably on the order of 40% of MR patients in hospital settings have implants, devices, some foreign body piece of shrapnel, or we're imaging them with ECG leads or other sort of foreign bodies, foreign materials in the study. So that 40% of MR patients ought not to have been done per manufacturer's instructions 20 years ago. So we have changed the patient cohort that we're exposing to MR. And that's just one of the changes over the last couple of decades that have increased risk factors in MR. So how do people get injured in MR? Several years ago, I expanded on the research that I did with Dr. Canal. We presented that at RSNA in 2012. I redid the information for Metrosense, which is a company that makes ferromagnetic detection systems. And we essentially took that red line data of adverse events. We looked specifically at the ones, the narrative described an MR specific injury that had occurred. And then we tested the narrative that explained how this injury occurred against best practices that could be found in the then 2013 ACR guidance document on safe MR practices, with the intent of trying to see, well, wait a second, if this prevention had been in place, if this information was available at the point of care, if any of these things, had been provided as indicated by the ACR guidance document, could that have had a reasonable chance of preventing this accident? And we went through the URLs for all my resources. I'll have a resource page at the end if you want to see that. We took the MRI specific injury accident. So if somebody falls off the table, you can fall off an exam table, you can fall out of your chair. That's not an MRI specific injury. If you get your fingers pinched in the table, that's not an MRI specific injury. So we looked at just the ones that are produced, injuries that result from the magnetic fields and the forces produced during the network study. And of those injury accidents, we found that 95% of 2 years worth of investigated FDA data, 95% of those injury accidents were burns, projectiles, and hearing damage. So if accreditation promises safety, shouldn't one of the cleanest, clearest, most unambiguous means of measuring safety be the ability to prevent injury accidents? I think that we can look at safety more broadly than that, but I think universally we should agree that safety as an objective, a very effective way to measure that is prevention of injury.
So first of all, can we provide that safety?
Right.
Promise it.
Right, yeah, exactly, we promise it. So how do people get injured, and how can those injuries be prevented? And are those preventions part of our fulfilling our promise of safety? So looking at each of the 3 injury categories, starting with projectiles, because the 2 years worth of data, depending on how you slice and dice this, that might be the single most effective set of preventions. Use of the ACR's 4-zone. Again, these are directly from the ACR guidance document on safe MR practices. Use of ferromagnetic detection and conspicuous labeling of objects or devices. These 3 preventions, when we looked at 2 years worth of projectile injury data, those 3 preventions would have prevented 69% of all the projectile injury accidents. The interesting thing is the 31% of the injury accidents that wouldn't have prevented, that was MRI service personnel. Those are people who are bringing known ferromagnetic tools or equipment or parts into the room and mishandle them. And so presumably none of these things are actually going to prevent a service personnel who has to bring a ferromagnetic fan unit for the MRI into the magnet. Need to educate people, absolutely. So if we were to look just at the clinical setting and projectile injury accidents that occurred either to clinical personnel or to patients, these three, in the 2 years of data that we looked at and we evaluated, these three preventions would have stopped 100% of the clinical setting projectile injury accidents. Burns are the #1 most frequently reported injury accident. Thankfully, severity tops out at a lower level than the projectile-related accidents. And the three preventions from the ACR guidance document are provided an air gap or padding between the transmitting RF element and the patient, remove unneeded electrically conductive material, and anything that has to be there, you should follow MR conditional conditions. And then the third one is preventing large caliber body loop skin-to-skin contact. Each one of these roughly accounts for 1/3 of the RF burn injuries. So simply doing one of them still leaves you open to the majority of other burn mechanisms that can occur.
Can we pause for a second? So as far as the padding, what I frequently hear when my team is not using it because the patient's too big, they'll put either just a towel or a sheet. Is that sufficient?
No.
Okay.
So I'm going to put an asterisk next to my note. Each manufacturer describes a minimum separation distance between the bore wall, and this only applies if you're using the integrated body coil for transmit. If you're doing a knee with a TR knee coil, or if you're fortunate enough to have TR head coils, then padding from the bore wall means nothing because the radio frequency energy is not coming from there. If you're using a smaller volume coil, a head coil, a knee coil, a foot and ankle coil, you're using a smaller quantity of RF because it no longer needs to spray all over the whole anatomy. So the risk of burn is inherently lower because you're using a smaller volume transmit coil. This is really, that concern is particular to when the body coil is doing the transmitting, which is most MR studies. So your manufacturer will describe a minimum set standoff distance from the bore wall. And that can be, 5 millimeters to a centimeter, depending on your MR system and the manufacturer's specs. The reason for that standoff distance is RF energy that we use in MR imaging is not too dissimilar from microwaves. When you are closer to the RF transmit source, there is what's called a dipole-dipole coupling. Essentially, it's microwave excitation, microwave heating. And depending on the specific frequency of the RF transmitters, which is a function of field strength, and depending on the position of the RF body coil transmitters behind the plastic covers in the bore, that distance may be, as I say, 5 millimeters, it may be a centimeter. It doesn't have to be a whole lot of space, but if you get into that standoff distance volume, the RF energy can essentially excite. What we think happens is we think it excites the water-fat boundary below subdermal fat. Now you have no temperature or pain sensors in subdermal fat, and you have none in the musculature below. So we can effectively cook you without you having any sensation in the moment. And there are multiple accounts of patients who come out from MR scanners and go, I got this itchy spot on my elbow or my shoulder, or typically something radially positioned that would have been up against the wall of the bore of the magnet. And over time, outside of the magnet, you'll be able to watch a burn develop superficial. The burn actually already occurred, but it occurred in the subdermal fat layer. And now it's just propagating up. Essentially, that heat is causing tissue death in the subdermal fat, and it's migrating its way out to the dermal layers. And there have been reported instances of MR providers watching a third-degree burn propagate on a patient after they come out of the MR, and there looks like there's a little erythema, there's a little redness in that area. Let's just sit down for a few minutes. We just want to make sure everything's okay. And sure enough, the third-degree burn essentially blooms out of the subdermal fat below it.
And my second part to that too is, especially with the clothing. So, everybody's been undressed, underwear, everything, but then we run into the problems where patients need help if they're chair-ridden, and then of course scheduling is telling them come in their comfy sweats. What is the best practice around that? Still making sure that they change into hospital gown?
Yes, most of the best practice facilities that I would point to for emulating now say gown to skin, not even underwear, because now there are a growing use of antimicrobial treatments in clothing, and the most popular materials used for antimicrobial treatments are copper and silver, both of which are fantastic electrical conductors. And so now all of a sudden you have your underwear has the potential of becoming an antenna to collect radio frequency energy and produce burns. And there are a number of recorded examples in the literature of patients getting burned because of antimicrobial athletic wear. It used to just be athletic wear, but now we're beginning to see, more and more of these treatments being applied to everyday clothing. The third most prevalent source of reported injury in MR that are classified as MR is hearing damage. Now, the 2013 ACR guidance document really only had one prevention for hearing damage, and that is provide hearing protection to your MR patients. The alarming thing is that 89% of the acoustic injuries, the patients were provided hearing protection. Now, we don't know if that just means, somebody handed them a packet and walked away, but clearly the notion that just giving the patient hearing protection protects their hearing is on its face incorrect. So Dr. Canal and I actually wanted to add a couple of additional protections for reduction of auditory injury, and that is to provide instruction and verify fit and function for patients so that they know the appropriate way to place them, and that we essentially QA/QC their hearing protection, and we make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to do before we send them in for the magnet. And then the number 3 option, again, 2 and 3 are Dr. Canal and I, our recommendations, not the ACR's. The third one is some patients, either because of unusual outer ear canal anatomy, or because they get the willies about putting something in their ear canal, can't or won't use the hearing protection correctly. Compressible foam earplugs. I can put a compressible foam earplug in my right ear first time every time. My left ear, there's something weird with the canal anatomy. It takes me 3, 4, 5, 6 attempts to seat it correctly so that it actually works. Now, I've used hearing protection, for 30 years for different activities, so I know what it means to be seated correctly and what the correct attenuation sounds like in the environment. So I know that it needs a 4th time, a 5th time, a 6th time to try and seat it correctly, and I know, the sensation of when that's there. Patients who don't have experience with hearing protection don't have that frame of reference. And if we tell them, put this in your ear and it will, protect your hearing, without giving them guidance on how to do that, without recognizing that for some patients that's just not going to work, and we need to give them over-the-ear muffs or swimmer's putty, silicone putty, which doesn't go into the outer ear canal. It essentially seals up around the outer aspect of the external ear anatomy. You need to have alternatives for the patients for whom conventional in-the-ear plugs just don't work. So looking at the 3 preventions for projectiles, the 3 preventions for burns, and the 1 ACR protection against auditory damage, those would have prevented 74% of all of the injury accidents that we identified in this 2-year period. Again, if at its most basic, the promise of safety is the reduction of injury, 74% reduction in injury. And if we take out the injuries that occurred to the MR service personnel, the projectile-related ones, that actually jumps up to 80%. We can prevent 8 out of 10 MR injury accidents with 3 projectile safety techniques, 3 radio frequency safety techniques, and the one, and hopefully we can even do better, push this 80% higher if we did better with our acoustic injury. This, to me, represents a massive leap forward in terms of safety. If everyone's accredited and accreditation promises safety, they're lying to us about MRI. The promise of safety as a function of accreditation, it just doesn't, it doesn't pass the test. Let's actually take a look at those, sort of prevention criteria that we know could stop, 80% of the injury accidents. Let's take a look at those criteria against the accreditation requirements from, here we're going to do alphabet soup, TJC, Joint Commission, the Joint Commission, DMV. It's like a Dutch company, and I think DMV stands for something in Dutch, and I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce it. American College of Radiology and Intersocietal Accreditation Commission. These are the 2 largest accreditation organizations on the hospital side and the 2 largest accreditation organizations on the outpatient imaging MRI accreditation side. Let's take a look at those criteria that we just identified and score. We're going to look at the explicit accreditation criteria. And just like we tested accident prevention and injury prevention, we're going to test whether or not elements of the accreditation actually fulfill these ACR guidance document best practices. So, Joint Commission accredited facilities? Yeah. And do you have ACR as well?
Yes.
Okay, so you're double dipping, so you should be doubly covered because you have 2 accreditations. For projectile safety, Joint Commission kinda requires 4 zones. They don't actually invoke the term zones. I think it's because they didn't want to give credit to the ACR for developing them. They talk about the MRI scanner room and the area immediately preceding the scanner room. So really they're describing zones 3 and 4. No mention of zone 2. Quite honestly, as far as I'm concerned, we should call it the 3 zone, because zone 1, right now, we are in zone 1 of your magnets, wherever they may be. We are in a space that has 0 MRI function and 0 MRI risk. That is the definition of zone 1. Zone 1 is the entire planet. As far as I'm concerned, I don't care that anybody ever marks their zone 1. So Joint Commission has kind of described zones 3 and 4, but they don't touch on zone 2, which is patient preparation space. They don't require ferromagnetic detection. They don't require device labeling. Now, anybody who's been surveyed from the Joint Commission recently has a decent chance that the surveyor wanted to see unsafe stickers on your staplers and your console chairs or whatever. That is the action of the surveyor. That is not a standard within the Joint Commission's diagnostic imaging standards. D&V Healthcare strikes out all three. ACR, I am being really generous in giving them a kinda in 4 zones. So ACR developed the 4 zones. Each and every one of these safety principles comes directly from the ACR's MRI safety best practice document. ACR requires, I'm going to goof up the specific language, but it's something like appropriate access controls. So they do mention that there should be some kind of access control as you approach the MRI. They don't describe where that should be, how that should function, or how that relates to screening or supervision or any of those things. So I'm being super generous, giving them a kinda for that one. IAC, like D&B, they strike out across the board for this. RF burden projection. Again, I'm being generous here. Joint Commission does not require padding, and they don't require explicitly the prevention of skin-to-skin contact. What they do require is training on patient positioning to reduce burn injuries or something to that effect. And I'm being super generous, and I'm assuming that that training includes your manufacturer indicated padding associated with this. And I'm assuming that that includes patient positioning such to prevent skin-to-skin contact within the volume of RF irradiation. Again, in this case, everybody else strikes out in terms of not having explicit criteria that cover, again, the things that we know. RF burn protection, in the 2 years that we looked at in terms of injury prevention, these would have stopped 94% of the RF burn injuries that were reported. So we know that these 3 preventions are extraordinarily effective. Hearing protection, Joint Commission, again, doesn't require hearing protection. They require training for MR techs on the fact that hearing protection is important. ACR requires that there is some policy on hearing protection. Doesn't mean that that policy has to require hearing protection. Your ACR compliance policy on hearing protection could be hearing protection good, and that could be the end of it. So again, the overwhelming majority of accreditation criteria compliance looks awful in terms of preventing known mechanisms of patient injury in MR. Now, so the 9 injury preventions, 7 of them are directly from the ACR guidance document. 2 of them that we didn't really try and count the potential effectiveness of were the ones developed by Dr. Canal and myself. So Joint Commission, really I should give them 1 out of the 9 or 1 out of the 7 if you just want to count the ACR conventions. DMV gets nothing. ACR, I really shouldn't even count that one. They should be 0 for 9 or 0 for 7. So the notion that accreditation provides protection when they don't even have explicit concrete expectations for the things that we know cause harm and the preventions that we know would prevent those harms. And as I said at the beginning, the reason we get accreditation is for money, because it is a condition of being reimbursed by CMS. Certain overachievers who manage to get more than 1 accreditation the second one doesn't get you higher levels of reimbursement. That's typically because in a hospital setting, Joint Commission criteria for image quality is not as strong as ACR criteria for image quality. So hospital-based facilities that get ACR accreditation for a magnet in addition to Joint Commission accreditation, what to me that represents is a stronger image quality component than you have in Joint Commission alone. again, the promise of safety, I think, doesn't hold water. So we do this for CMS reimbursement. CMS actually builds a set of requirements for accreditation organizations. If you are going to be one of our approved or deemed accrediting organizations, you have to do X, Y, and Z. And there's a separate list for accrediting organizations that accredit hospitals and the ones that accredit outpatient imaging centers. This is from a document that CMS published in 2015. And again, all the links will be on the resources slide at the very end. This is CMS conditions of participation for safety in radiology. It's not the formal title of the document, but that's effectively what it is. There are modality-specific safety requirements, and then there are general radiology safety requirements. This is from the general radiology safety requirements. And I'm going to zoom in on these two elements. And forgive me as I commit the cardinal sin of a presenter and I read to you from my slides. The first bullet point is training required by personnel permitted to enter areas where the radiologic services are provided. Second bullet point, training and, as applicable, qualifications required for personnel who perform diagnostic imaging studies or therapeutic procedures utilizing radiologic services equipment. This includes proper operation of equipment per manufacturer's instructions and hospital policy. In English, train all employees who are allowed to enter the area of service in radiology, and train all employees who operate the imaging equipment on safe and effective operation of that equipment. All right, that seems really straightforward. This is a CMS condition of participation required of the imaging accreditation providers or hospital accreditation providers. Safety training for personnel permitted to enter, safety training for personnel performing the studies. This is a requirement for reimbursement from CMS. Joint Commission does have, this is the first out and out check that we've been able to drop in. They do have safety training requirement for MRI operators, but nobody else inside the MR environment is required to have any safety training. So your tech aides, your radiology nurses, anesthesia, respiratory, transport, anybody whose job duties bring them into MRI. Joint Commission, the explicit diagnostic imaging standards don't say anything about that. Now, I asked Joint Commission about this, and I said, guys, CMS requires you to have this. You don't have this. Isn't that a problem? And Joint Commission said, well, we've got this standard that essentially, and I'm oversimplifying it here, but practice safe healthcare. Train personnel appropriately in the healthcare environment. And they essentially point to these broad umbrella standards. And they say, well, we really cover training personnel permitted to enter, in the provide appropriate training, general, hospital level, enterprise level standard. Like you have a diagnostic imaging standard. This is a CMS condition of participation specifically for radiology services. Why isn't that there? They didn't like that very much. DMV,
Yes, it's in reverse. Joint Commission is like.
Could be. Joint Commission, in my experience, is an incredibly opaque organization in terms of what they have in the works, what they are planning to roll out in terms of new standards. If you're not on their advisory committee, yeah.
And I assume like we promise that one should go away.
Lots of people want me to go away. Yeah, they're not the only ones. ACR doesn't have explicit standards for either. Again, ACR, the folks who invented MRI safety, don't have these in their MRI accreditation requirements. IAC kind of has requirements for safety training for personnel performing studies. They don't require the facility to provide training. They recommend that techs, as a part of their annual CE, get at least one CE on something related to safety.
Does the Joint Commission require that as well? Because when they come and they ask me, well, hey, do you guys provide training? Previously, I wasn't, but now I do have a module of it. It is usually left upon the tech to have some sort of continuing education. The Joint Commission doesn't specify whether it's on-site or CEs, right?
So no, they don't specify whether it's facility provided or individual. They do specify what the content needs to be. And there are 7 explicit content areas that are required elements of Joint Commission annual MRI safety training. And I'd be more than happy to dig that up and share that with you afterwards. Now I blotted out our outpatient imaging accreditation providers because that conditions of participation document, the training requirements that we were looking at from CMS, that only applies to hospitals. I asked CMS, wait a minute, where's the parallel structure for outpatient imaging facilities? And CMS said, we don't have one.
What's the difference? Scanner.
So for a CT, is ionizing radiation less ionizing because I get it in a strip mall dock in the box? How can you?
Scanner, magnetic field, right?
How can you rationalize having one set of safety standards for both patients and clinical personnel if that service is rendered on this side of the street, but if you render the exact same service on the opposite side of the street, there are functionally no minimums, no safety minimum standards from CMS. So these 2 training criteria here directly from the CMS conditions of participation document don't apply to outpatient imaging. I said that we were looking at the big dogs, the 2 largest accrediting providers, both on the hospital side and the outpatient imaging side. Let's look at the smaller market share hospital accreditation organizations. There are 2 others, ACHC and CIHQ. ACHC demonstrates that it is possible to do this. ACHC essentially copied and pasted those conditions of participation from the CMS document directly into their radiology accreditation standards. Now, they don't repeat this specifically, here are the training requirements for CT, here are the training requirements for PET, here are the training requirements for fluoro, here are the training requirements for MR. They do it once in kind of a blanket format, but they say in radiology, personnel who are permitted to enter the area of service must have safety training. In radiology, individuals who are operating the equipment must have appropriate safety training. So it doesn't have to be, repeated 50 zillion times. ACHC essentially did it once and covers all of radiology, but it's unambiguous that in MRI, if you have healthcare personnel, hospital personnel working in this environment, allowed to enter this environment, you gotta provide them training on MRI safety. So what does this mean if clearly we can't depend on the accreditation organizations to provide any kind of guarantee of safety? What it means is it's up to us individually. It's up to the individual sites to have policies and procedures. I'll say 2 things about policies and procedures. Number 1, those policies and procedures need to accurately reflect your practices. If your practices and your policies and procedures don't match and something goes wrong, you are legally up a creek, and in a very, very bad way. The second thing that your policies and procedures need to be compared against is industry best practice. And again, since we're just talking safety, I will say from a safety standpoint, your policies and procedures really need to be benchmarked against the ACR now 2020 manual on MR safety. And if you don't benchmark against that, in my opinion, you really should be providing a rationale as to why you're using a different standard or a different set of expectations. In the, God forbid, unfortunate event that somebody gets hurt, and you need to rationalize your actions. So policies and procedures need to be referenced to industry best practices, and they need to be reflective of your practices. If there's a disconnect between policy and practice, one or both of those needs to change immediately. The two of them need to be Siamese twins. It is up to individuals with oversight, and this means both responsibility and authority in MR. And I suggest the MRMD, MRSO, MRSE structure. It is up to us individually today, because accreditation is not going to prevent injuries, accidents, harm to patients, damage to equipment, given where the accreditation standards are today. So, and this is what I was talking about on the previous slide. Identify when the last time you did essentially an MRI safety policy procedure audit. I work with sites on specifically this, on maintaining policies and procedures that follow industry best practice and making sure that site practice actually adheres to those. I will go in and I will take a look at policies and procedures, and I want to see the endorsement, name and date of the MRMD, the radiologist who is in charge of MRI safety policy for the institution. I want to see that this policy was reviewed by Dr. on, fill in the date, and that date is sometime within the last 12 months. Similarly, if it's not a clinical policy, but an operational policy, I want to see the exact same thing from the administrative director of radiology. I want to see director of radiology, fill in the name, date that this policy was reviewed and reapproved. Because I think policies and procedures too easily get stuffed in a binder or the PDF equivalent of a binder, and nobody ever looks at them again. And I think that when facilities look at policy and procedure manuals as regulatory checkbox items that you need to pull out to show a surveyor once a year and then they put it back on the shelf, you're missing a tremendous opportunity. I think policy and procedure manuals should be dummies guides. They should be tools to help onboarding new employees. They should guide expectations of practice. They should direct when supplemental training or remedial training might be indicated based on problems or concerns that arise. They should be more than just a regulatory checkbox compliance item. Does your site have an MRI safety org chart? One of the things that drives me absolutely crazy is when I go to a site and I ask who is responsible for safety, for MRI safety, and the response I get is, well, we're all responsible for MRI safety. No, we're not, or we shouldn't be. Not that we're not all responsible for our part in carrying out policies, procedures, and standard practices, but if your organization doesn't have a clear line of responsibility and authority specific to MRI safety, you're missing out. There's a story that haunts me to this day. This was something I learned in like a freshman psychology class. Story of a woman named Kitty Genovese. This is, the name may tickle something in your memory because this was kind of a famous, real world psychological investigation. It's the 1930s or something like that. Kitty Genovese, I think she was a nurse, lived in New York City in a large apartment building, sort of a U-shaped apartment building with sort of a central courtyard. You came in off the street, through the central courtyard to the main entrance of the building, and it was 10, 15 stories tall. And so there were a whole mess of apartments that kind of looked into the central courtyard, and there were a whole mess of apartments that kind of looked out to the rest of the city. Kitty Genovese worked like second shift, and so she's getting home late at night, and she's mugged in that entry courtyard in the middle of the apartment building, and she fights back, and her mugger beats her to death in the central courtyard. I don't remember exactly what time, let's make it up, let's say at midnight. The police show up at 5 a.m. to investigate the murder, because that's the first they heard about it. Not because nobody in this massive apartment building didn't see and hear what was going on at the time. In fact, some of the residents turned off the lights in their apartment so that their eyes would dark adapt faster so that they could see what was going on. Dozens and dozens of residents in the apartment watched this woman get beat to death in the entry courtyard to the apartment building. And when they interviewed them, because people were aghast at the idea of how could this happen? How could nobody have called the police when this crime was being committed? The answer that got repeated over and over and over again was, well, the building is so large, there's so many people who see into that courtyard. I was certain that somebody else had called.
I thought my name was.
Exactly. So when we say, with the best of intention, MRI safety is everybody's responsibility, we create a Kitty Genovese situation. We create a situation where I have no immediate, direct, answerable responsibility because we all kind of collectively share it. This is the group project, right? And I can kind of slack off because I'm sure somebody else is an overachiever and they're going to pick up, my slack. So your organization needs to have an org chart specific to MRI safety. And I recommend, again, the MRMD, supervising clinician, MRSO, MR safety officer, typically a senior MR tech, and an MRSE, typically a medical physicist.
Going back to where you're going to start with this, when you get the answer of it's everyone's responsibility, MRC is everyone's responsibility. Is that, oh, correct, he asked me a question, we don't really have it, so this is my response, or is that kind of a, yes, it is everyone's responsibility, and I think that's okay.
More often than not, and I try and drill down when somebody gives me that answer. I don't, presume which of those two versions of that answer, that person is giving. I try and drill down.
If it's genuine, it's not a bad answer because it is. But if they're, you know what I'm saying, it's kind of context. But if they're saying it like, oh crap, he's got me, I'm gonna go with this, then it's
right. And in my experience, when I drill down, it is more often but the analogy that I like to use, or the comparison that I like to use, is this. Oh, hold on a sec. I think it's a slide. No. Don't apologize. If you do this and have these individuals appointed, this is my commercial message as a member of the ABMRS that certified these people. It's a volunteer board. I get nothing from making this suggestion to you guys. Get your individuals in these roles credentialed so you have some minimum objective sense of their competency and their knowledge base in terms of MRI safety. If your facility has, ionizing radiation state licensure, you have to have a radiation safety officer. If you have a RAM license, you have to have a radiation safety officer and a radiation safety committee. And that committee has minimum participation requirements, and it has minimum meeting requirements. It has minimum documentation requirements. If you fail to do any of those, you put your RAM license in jeopardy. Ionizing radiation, certainly in radiology today, if we exclude IR for the moment at least, if we're just talking diagnostics, ionizing radiation risk to the patient population has nosedived over the last 20 years because we have lower energy, more sensitive detectors, which means we can use lower energy tubes. We can reduce ionizing radiation exposure for any individual exam to a patient. If we have egregious overdoses of ionizing radiation in a diagnostic setting, what have we done to that patient besides giving them erythema in the moment? An egregious overdose in X-ray or even CT is, oh my goodness, we might have increased your lifetime risk of developing cancer by 0.5% over the next 60 years of your life. Now, that's pretty significant overexposure to get you to a 0.5 or 1% increased lifetime risk of developing a cancer 20, 30, 40 years following the exposure. This is, a sentinel event in CT is a 1% lifetime, increased risk of cancer. In MR, we might kill you instantly if we bring that oxygen tank into the room. We might provide, leave you with a permanent disability. We might give you 3rd degree, 4th degree burns, burn resulting in amputation of the limb. There are instances of, burns with pulse oximeters wrapped around an infant's arm, was concealed in a blanket. And they did MR, and essentially they burned the periphery of the child's wrist, and the child lost their hand below the elbow because of an MR induced burn. So the degree to which we can induce significant life-altering injury or kill somebody in MR, as compared to what happens in CT, is night and day. And yet, from a radiation safety standpoint, you have to have an RSO. You have to have a radiation safety committee. That committee has to meet. That committee has to document. That committee has to have, recorded minutes. And you lose your RAM license if you can't produce that when asked. Why do we have those requirements on the ionizing side when the risks are at least as great, if not greater, on the MR side, and nobody is individually responsible on MR? So my recommendation is your site should have an MR safety committee. You should essentially take your radiation safety structure and mirror it and create an MR safety structure that is equivalent to your structure. Establish a committee, do quarterly meetings. If you want to sort of mirror the minimum expectations of a RAM license, do quarterly meetings. Set and benchmark performance improvements specific to MR safety. Doing this even just inwardly looking within a radiology department is incredibly powerful. But then the last bullet item is to cultivate institutional enterprise level support. If you can have sort of quality and safety office of an enterprise, coordinate and offer support to a MRI safety committee within the department, because it's not an island. We don't own our own patients. They're all referrals. So we can get our house together, singing like a well-oiled machine But if we can't effectively interface with referring services, the whole thing is going to break down, no matter how effectively we have our own house in order. So an MRI safety committee, to the degree you can, link up with enterprise level quality and safety initiatives, so that when it comes time to reaching outward, you have that enterprise level support. And I told you I would give you the resources. So the 20-year accident rate data, the injury prevention infographic, and then the specific CMS conditions of participation document that I pulled the training requirements. There are sections in that document particular to MRI. And I believe they're going to make the slides available. So hopefully in the PDF, the URLs should actually work like hyperlinks, so you don't have to type out this mile-long URL. So I'm going to summarize and then I'll answer any questions anybody has left over. In short, to the question posed in the title of this presentation, absolutely not. Your accreditation standard, and we've tested most of them, your accreditation standard offers you no assurances, despite their marketing claims, of actually reducing MRI accidents and injuries. Their criteria just don't cover it. Particularly if you're in the hospital setting, your accreditation standards may not actually cover what you're required to have as a CMS beneficiary, or I guess the beneficiaries of the patients, to be reimbursed by CMS. Your accreditation standards may not actually cover the minimums that you as a facility are supposed to do as a condition of participation for CMS reimbursement. If you are in an outpatient imaging center, non-affiliated, not owned by, controlled by a hospital, but an independent IVTF, CMS has no minimum standards for you. So while your accreditation organizations tell you you will be safer with us in MRI, that is most definitely not the case. You are safer only if and when you make the conscious decision to be, and you make the preparations, you take the steps that are necessary to assure that in your facility.